Hey everybody, welcome to this little fun activity in the chem lab today about limiting an excess reagent. We're going to make Hoozits. So what's a Hoozit? Well, that's what it is. So in the activity today, we're going to use this as a visualization for what happens in the lab, in the chem lab, when we use limiting and excess reagents. So as we talked about before, we know that in chemistry, we like to set up our chemical reactions by having purposefully put in too much of one reactant. And we do this so that the reaction can proceed at a faster rate, or we could do this also so that we get closer to our theoretical yield. There are many reasons why we would want to have more of one of the reactants than we actually need. So to help us understand this concept of limiting an excess reagent, we're going to do this little activity here. It says in your procedure that you need to start with 17 grams of bolts, 17 grams of washers, and 17 grams of the nuts without going over. And so what we're going to do is I'm going to show you essentially what that means. So we're going to take, I'm going to start with, let's see, the bolts are first. And we have to go, nope, because we can't go over 17 grams. Okay, so that would give us 3 bolts at 16.05. We can't add a 4th one, like I said, because we go over 17, and the procedure says to not go over 17. So we have 3. Then we have 17 grams of washers. Whoops, one too many again. So we're at 1486. Yeah, so we go over 17, so we're gonna have to remove one and be at 6 washers. $17 grams of the nuts. All right. Oh, way too much. Still too much. Okay. And so here we have 5. So this is how much we have. 17 grams of each of the reactants. Now we need to pause the video and to complete part 1 of the activity. So please pause the video and complete part 1 of the activity. So after completing the assembly of our Hoozits, well, this is what we've got. So we can use, we can fill out this data table, answer the questions for part 1, and then we're going to use this information to move to part 2. In part 2, what we're going to do is we're going to try to predict how we can do this more efficiently in terms of what we want to do here is to produce 4 Hoozits, but we don't want to have any leftovers. So we don't want to have any extra washers or extra bolts. And to do that, we can only use the information that we have from part 1 to figure out how much to weigh. And this is very, very important. You can't count individual pieces like one at a time and put them on the scale, because remember, we're in chemistry and we couldn't do that with atoms. We can't take one atom one by one and weigh them individually. So this is an activity to understand chemistry, and so we're going to do it the same way as we would do chemistry. So how are we going to make 4 Hoozits? How much do we need to weigh? How much of the bolts do we need to weigh? How much of the washers do we need to weigh? How much of the nuts do we need to weigh to make 4 of each? And to do that, you have to use the information that you obtained in the first part. Now remember, in part 1, we know how much 17 grams gives us. For example, we know that 17 grams of bolts gives us 3 bolts. So how much are you going to weigh then to be able to make 4 Hoozits? Right? We know that 17 grams of washers gave us 6 of them. So how much are we going to weigh? How many grams of washers are we going to weigh to make our 4 Hoozits? So now pause the video and take some time to think about your calculations. How would you calculate that amount? And before you start the video again, have those 3 mass numbers ready. I'm going to weigh this many grams of bolts, I'm going to weigh this many grams of washers, and I'm going to weigh this many grams of nuts in order to make 4 Hoozits with no leftovers. So here's how I'm going to set up my problem. When I calculate the mass of bolts, I know that 17 grams, that gave me 3. There were 3 bolts in 17 grams. Now, because I want to make 4 Hoozits, I'm going to need 4 bolts, right? So how many grams do I need to get me 4 bolts? And so now I have it set up, whereas 17 over x is equal to 3 over 4. And then it's simple because I can just cross multiply this and get the value for x, which is the grams that I need to get 4 bolts. So by cross multiplying, we have 17 times 4 is equal to 3 times x. So I can divide by 3. And so now I have x, which is equal to 17 times 4 divided by 3. So when I complete my calculation, I see that 17 times 4 divided by 3 is equal to 22.67 grams. So I'm going to round that to a whole number for 23 grams. So 23 grams is the mass of bolts that I need to weigh, and that should allow me to make 4 Hoozits, right, or to get 4 bolts. And we do the same thing for washers and for nuts. The washers we had originally weighed 17 grams, and that gave us 6 of them. So how many grams am I going to weigh to get 4 washers? And I want 4 washers because I want to make 4 Hoozits, and there's 1 washer in each Hoozit. So 17 times 4 divided by 6 is 11.3, which means 11 grams of washers should allow me to make 4 Hoozits. And the same with the nuts, and I get, same calculation, I get 14 grams. So then all I have to do is to verify that this is correct. The moment of truth. 23 grams of bolts Now remember, we're not going over, right? Whoop. So 23 grams of bolts and 11 grams of washers without going over. 11 grams. Oop. 11 grams of washers. And 14 grams of nuts. Oop. 14 grams without going over. Oop. Well, what do you know? That sure looks like it's going to work. And now you're ready to do part 3. In part 3, you have to make some calculations and predictions to make 50 Hoozits. Not Hoozits, but Hoozits. So when we look carefully at the diagram, a Hoozit has 4 parts to it. So using the information from part 1 and the way that we calculated it for part 2, make your predictions and tell me what is the mass of bolts that you need to weigh to make 50 Hoozits. What is the mass of washers that you need to weigh to make 50 Hoozits, and the mass of nuts that you need to weigh, again, to make 50 Hoozits, and hopefully with no leftovers. Good luck. I hope that you enjoyed the activity on limiting an excess reagent. To complete the activity, you'll need to explain in your own words what the limiting reagent is, the excess reagent, the theoretical yield, and the actual yield. So I think we've talked at length about the limiting and excess reagent. The theoretical yield and the actual yield, what this means is the theoretical yield is that in theory, right, if everything goes well, that's how much we should make. So for example, in part 2, when we measured the mass of the bolts and the washers and the nuts, we were measuring the mass that we hoped would produce 4 Hoozits. And so that was the theoretical yield, right? We were doing this, and in theory, that would have given us 4 Hoozits. The actual yield is what we're actually able to make. Now, based upon our calculations and the procedure that we did, well, as you can see, we will actually be able to make 4 Hoozits, but that wasn't a guarantee, right? So in this particular case, our theoretical yield was 4, which is what we were predicting to make, and our actual yield is also 4. So it worked out perfectly. But again, that's not always the case. Hopefully this activity helped you and made the concepts of limiting excess reagent and theoretical yield and actual yield a little bit more clear. Thanks for being with me today. Have a great day.